There is a library in Munich that contains Adolf Hitler's personal book collection, over 16,000 volumes. He read them, not skimmed them, not displayed them, but read and annotated them, argued with them in the margins, folded down the corners of pages he wanted to return to. He underlined passages. He wrote rebuttals. He carried books to the front during World War I and read in the trenches. Joseph Stalin's personal library contained over 20,000 books, thousands of them with his handwriting in the margins. Saddam Hussein wrote 4 novels, romance novels, while running one of the most brutal regimes of the late 20th century. Augusto Pinochet wrote several books on geopolitics and military theory, was an avid reader his entire life, and oversaw the disappearance and murder of thousands of Chileans. Mao Zedong wrote classical poetry that scholars have genuinely admired. Muammar Gaddafi published a philosophical tract, The Green Book, that he considered a rival to Marx's Capital. Kim Il-sung had an entire mythology of intellectual genius constructed around him, complete with fabricated publication records. Pol Pot studied in Paris, read Rousseau in the original French, attended lectures on Marxist theory, and returned home to oversee the deaths of approximately 2 million people. You have been told in some form your whole life that reading makes you better, that books build empathy, perspective, moral complexity, that the person who reads widely is, almost by definition, a person who understands the world more honestly than the person who doesn't. That literature is a humanizing force. The reading lists of the 20th century's worst people are the most precise possible refutation of this idea, and the question it forces you to ask about what books actually do, about what you have been getting from the ones you've read, about the comfortable story you tell yourself about your own intellectual life, is one that most people find ways not to answer. The comfortable version of this story is that these men read the wrong books, that Hitler read racial pseudoscience and it corrupted him, that Pol Pot read the wrong Marxists, that if any of them had encountered the right text at the right moment, the outcome would have been different, that the problem is the content, not the act, that reading itself remains clean. This version is wrong, and it is wrong in a way that matters. Hitler did not read only racial pseudoscience. He read architecture, military history, philosophy, opera criticism, political theory. He read Schopenhauer in the trenches. He read Nietzsche, Darwin, the Bible. He read widely, he read badly in the sense that matters, not technically but morally, not as a process of genuine encounter with ideas, but as a process of selective acquisition of whatever confirmed and amplified what was already there. This is the thing that the reading makes you better narrative has always refused to confront. Books do not have inherent redemptive power. They have the power of what you bring to them. They reflect the mind that reads them. A generous reader finds generosity in texts. A paranoid reader finds confirmation. A man who has already decided that certain people are less than human can read Nietzsche and find a philosopher, read Darwin and find a biologist, read ancient history and find precedent, and none of those books has actually worked on him in the way we want to believe books work. The psychological concept at the center of this video is called motivated reading. It is not a formal term from the clinical literature, but the process it names is documented everywhere from cognitive science to the history of ideology, the way we approach almost all information, including books, not as open inquiry, but as a search for raw material. We find what we are looking for, we retain what confirms, we forget what challenges. And the more intelligent we are, the better we are at this, because intelligence, absent something rarer, is extremely good at building the structures that protect what it already believes. What follows is a typology, not a list of monsters, but a set of case studies in what motivated reading looks like across different kinds of minds: the obsessive annotator, the genuine intellectual, the colonial student, the self-mythologizer, the book burner who read and the one who barely read at all, each one different, each one arriving at the same place. The books did not save them. In some cases, the books helped. The library Hitler assembled is one of the most extensively studied private collections in history. Timothy Ryback spent years examining what survives of it, and what he found was not what most people expect. There is a copy of Don Quixote with Hitler's bookplate, books on architecture, books on Wagner, books on the occult, military manuals annotated in careful German, books on Frederick the Great he returned to throughout his life, a book of American Indian myths he owned as a teenager and kept into adulthood. He read Karl May westerns obsessively as a child, adventure stories set in the American West that he never entirely outgrew, that he recommended to his generals during the Russian campaign as models of tactical thinking. He was reading pulp fiction about cowboys and calling it strategy. He read Schopenhauer in the trenches of World War I. Schopenhauer, who described the world as fundamentally irrational, driven by blind will rather than reason. Hitler found in this not nihilism but permission. If the world is driven by will, not reason, then the man with the strongest will is not transgressing against reality, he is enacting it. He read Nietzsche, or rather he read about Nietzsche, and visited the Nietzsche archive, and posed for photographs with a bust of the philosopher. Nietzsche himself, who wrote devastating critiques of German nationalism and anti-Semitism and would have been horrified by almost everything done in his name, was simply read past. The passages about the will to power were retained. The passages about what the Übermensch actually required, self-mastery, not domination of others, were not retained because they were inconvenient. He read racial pseudoscience, the Ostara pamphlets, the Houston Stewart Chamberlain race theories, the catalogue of pseudo-Darwinian hierarchy that was circulating in Vienna when he lived there as a young man. This is the reading that most people focus on, and it is genuinely important. But its importance is not that it created his beliefs. Its importance is that it gave his pre-existing hatreds a vocabulary, a pseudo-scientific framework, a set of citations. He did not become an anti-Semite by reading racial pseudoscience. He used racial pseudoscience to make his anti-Semitism feel like a conclusion rather than a prejudice. One detail in Rybak's account stays with you. Hitler had a German history primer he owned as a child. In the margins, in a child's handwriting, he had written his name, Adolf Hitler. And beside certain passages about German military glory, beside certain descriptions of a unified German people, there are pencil marks, emphasis. He was 12 years old. The books came after. The certainty came first. And every book he ever read was processed through that 12-year-old's underlines. 16,000 volumes, and not one of them got past the boy in the margins. Stalin's relationship with books was more intellectually serious than Hitler's, and somehow more disturbing for it. He was trained as a Georgian Orthodox priest before he became a revolutionary. This meant he had genuine formation in textual analysis, in close reading, in the interpretation of difficult texts within a tradition. He knew how to read carefully. He did read carefully. The annotations in his personal library, over 20,000 volumes, run to hundreds of thousands of words across thousands of books. Arguments, corrections, agreements, dismissals, the running commentary of a man genuinely engaging with what he read. He read Anatole France and marked passages about the relationship between power and truth. He read Zola and wrote notes on naturalism. He read the Russian symbolist poets and knew enough to have real opinions about them. He read Marx directly and the German idealist philosophers that Marx drew on, and he understood the philosophical lineage in a way that most of his contemporaries in the Soviet leadership did not. He read Bulgakov. This is the detail that historians return to because it is so strange. Mikhail Bulgakov wrote The Master and Margarita, one of the great satirical novels of the 20th century, and he was doing it while Stalin was in power, and Stalin protected him. Bulgakov wrote letters to Stalin personally, begging for the right to emigrate or to work, and Stalin called him on the telephone. Stalin, who was at that point overseeing purges killing hundreds of thousands of people, personally called a playwright to discuss his work. He attended Bulgakov's Playdays of the Turbines multiple times. He apparently found it genuinely moving. This is the detail that destroys the simple story. A man who wept at theatre, who read Zola, who argued in the margins about linguistics, who was by any formal measure a serious reader. This man signed death lists with a fountain pen at his desk and went home to read in the evenings. The psychological literature on compartmentalization is not sufficient to explain this. Compartmentalization is a defense mechanism, a way of not connecting things that are connected. But Stalin was not connecting. He was simultaneously holding both. He valued literature. He valued it genuinely. And this did not produce in him anything resembling mercy. What his reading produced was something more useful to him and more damaging to everyone around him: sophistication. He could read a manuscript and understand exactly where the danger was, where the subversion was buried. He could talk to writers about their work in a way that made them feel understood, and he could then, with the same intelligence that produced the understanding, calculate precisely what needed to happen to them. His most chilling annotation is in a linguistics textbook. He wrote in the margin, next to a passage about the social function of language, "Language is a weapon." 3 words. The reading of an entire book on linguistics produced for Stalin one thing: a new way to think about control. Saddam Hussein wrote 4 novels. This fact is worth sitting with for a moment before moving past it. Published between 2001 and 2004, the last 2 appearing after the American invasion while he was in hiding or in captivity. They were published under the name He Who Writes, an Arabic phrase that functions as a kind of defiant anonymity. Everyone knew they were his. The pretense of anonymity was part of the performance. The most famous is Zabiba and the King, published in 2000, which is an allegorical romance about a powerful king who falls in love with a simple woman named Zabiba. The king represents Iraq. Zabiba represents the Iraqi people. The rape of Zabiba by her husband represents, and Hussein made this explicit in interviews, the American invasion of 1991. It was adapted into a theatrical production that ran for months in Baghdad. Schools discussed it as literature. His son Uday produced a film version. He was not a casual writer of these books. He was an engaged one. He had ideas about narrative, about allegory, about the relationship between the ruler and the ruled. He had read widely enough in Arab classical literature and in translated Western novels to know what he was attempting. The books are not good. They are didactic, narcissistic, transparently self-serving in their political allegories, but they are not accidental. They are the product of a man who thought of himself as a literary figure. This self-conception as intellectual is crucial to understanding how Hussein operated. He also commissioned an enormous biography of himself, modelled on the grand political biographies of Western leaders. He read voraciously in Arab history, particularly the history of Saladin, the 12th century Kurdish Muslim leader who reconquered Jerusalem from the Crusaders. He identified with Saladin explicitly and extensively. He rebuilt the walls of Babylon and had his name inscribed on the bricks alongside Nebuchadnezzar's. He was constructing a literary self that was also a historical self, placing himself inside a narrative of Arab greatness that the reading had supplied. This is motivated reading of a specific and particularly grandiose kind, reading as casting. You read history to find the role you will play in it. You find the precedents that make your actions feel inevitable rather than chosen. You surround yourself with a library that reflects back, at every turn, the image of yourself that you require. While he was writing his romance novels, his security apparatus was using electric drills on prisoners. The man who wrote about a king's tender love for his people ran one of the most extensive torture systems of the late 20th century. The novels were not hypocrisy, they were a genuine expression of how he saw himself. He was the sensitive king. The people around him simply did not understand this. The reading had told him so. Pol Pot's case is the one that sits most uncomfortably in the liberal imagination because it strikes closest to home. He was educated in France on a scholarship in Paris in the early 1950s. He studied electronics at a technical school which he failed, and he spent his time reading in the libraries and attending meetings of the French Communist Party and absorbing, with the attention of a bookish young man far from home, the French intellectual culture of the moment. He was not a peripheral figure in these circles. He was engaged. He wrote articles for a Cambodian student journal arguing for Marxist revolution in his home country. He was forming ideas. He read Rousseau, The Social Contract, the idea of the general will, the theory that civilization had corrupted the natural goodness of human beings. This was not peripheral to his reading. It was central to it. He read Rousseau and he read the French Romantic poets and he read Marx, and the synthesis he built from these was Year Zero. The idea that Cambodian society needed to be completely erased and rebuilt from the beginning, that the cities were corrupted and the peasant was pure, that to reach the original goodness of the human being, you had to strip away everything that had accumulated since. He also read Frantz Fanon's The Wretched of the Earth, the great anti-colonial text that argued colonized people had to engage in violence to reclaim their psychological autonomy, that the cathartic act of resistance was itself a form of liberation. Fanon was writing about a specific psychological condition under colonialism. Pol Pot read it as operational doctrine. The Khmer Rouge evacuated Phnom Penh within days of taking power in 1975. They forced the entire urban population into the countryside at gunpoint. They abolished money, schools, hospitals. They executed doctors, teachers, engineers. They killed anyone who wore glasses because glasses were a sign of literacy, which was a sign of connection to the corrupted world that needed to be destroyed. Between 1.5 and 2 million people died out of a population of approximately 8 million. Rousseau did not cause this, Fanon did not cause this, the books did not cause this, but the ideas in those books, the idea of an original purity, the idea that the sophisticated and the educated were the problem, the idea that a total reset was possible and desirable, that violence was cleansing, were read by a man with a specific psychology, a specific capacity for abstraction, a specific willingness to reason from first principles to their conclusions regardless of the bodies the conclusions required. The reading gave the psychology its vocabulary and its framework, and critically, its sense of historical inevitability. He spent 2 years in Paris reading in libraries. He returned to Cambodia with a plan. The plan was made of books, and it killed 1 in 4 Cambodians. Mao Zedong's reading was lifelong and genuinely wide. He read the ancient Chinese classics, the 4 books and 5 classics of the Confucian tradition, with the attention of a student who had been trained to take them seriously. He read Chinese military philosophy, particularly Sun Tzu, not as historical curiosity, but as living instruction. He applied it. His early military campaigns against the nationalists drew directly on Sun Tzu's principles of guerrilla warfare, of yielding to superior force and striking at weakness. He also wrote poetry that scholars have genuinely admired, classical Chinese verse in the CI form with precise attention to tonal patterns and historical allusion. A poem he wrote in 1935 called Snow is taught in Chinese schools to this day and considered by some literary critics a real accomplishment of the form. This is not propaganda, or not only propaganda. The man could write. He had read enough to be able to write, and he knew it, and it was important to his self-conception in a way that was inseparable from his politics. He read Western texts in translation. He read Adam Smith and described him as a brilliant observer of capitalism's mechanics while planning to dismantle capitalism entirely. He read Darwin and took from evolutionary theory the same lesson others on this list took, that struggle is the primary mechanism of progress, that things which cannot survive their environment should not be protected from that fate. He read Hegel and extracted the dialectic without extracting the humanism. He read Marxist-Leninist texts with the specific goal of adapting them to Chinese conditions, which he understood better than the Soviet advisors who kept telling him he was applying the theory incorrectly. He was adapting it. The adaptation produced the Great Leap Forward, which killed between 15 and 45 million people through famine and violence between 1958 and 1962. It produced the Cultural Revolution, in which teachers were beaten by their students, temples were destroyed, books were burned, and the country's own cultural heritage was systematically attacked by a man who had spent his life reading. This is the detail that should stop you. Mao did not burn books out of ignorance. He burned books, or rather oversaw a movement that burned books, destroyed libraries, humiliated scholars from inside an extensive education. He knew what he was destroying. He had read it. The books he ordered destroyed or suppressed were books he had often read himself. The Cultural Revolution was not the act of a man who didn't understand what culture was. It was the act of a man who understood it perfectly and found it politically threatening. Reading had given him taste. It had not given him scruple. On September 12, 1973, the day after the coup that brought Augusto Pinochet to power in Chile, soldiers burned books in the streets of Santiago. Pablo Neruda, Gabriel Garcia Marquez, Marx, Lenin, Che Guevara. Bonfires of Chilean intellectual life in public as a demonstration of what the new order would require. Pinochet watched this, or was aware of it, and did not stop it. He had by this point read more military theory than most of the men burning the books had read in total. He was a career military officer who had spent decades studying the art of war. He taught at the War Academy. He wrote a textbook on geopolitics, Geopolitica, that was used as curriculum. He wrote a book on the War of the Pacific. He was not a functionary who stumbled into power. He was a man who had built an intellectual framework for what military power was and what it was for, and the framework was extensive and the reading behind it was real. His geopolitical reading was deeply influenced by German geopolitic theory, the school of thought that argued national power was a function of territory, resources, and the biological vitality of a people. This was the same intellectual tradition that had influenced Nazi expansionism, filtered through a Cold War lens in which the enemy was communism rather than racial impurity, but the underlying logic of the state as organism that must expand or die remained. He read these theories with the attention of a professional. He took notes. He taught them. He also read extensively in economics, particularly after the coup, when he handed economic policy to the Chicago Boys, Chilean economists trained at the University of Chicago under Milton Friedman, and oversaw one of the most radical free market experiments in history. He read the theory. He understood what was being proposed. He endorsed it with full intellectual engagement. Between 1973 and 1990, his regime killed approximately 3,000 people, tortured tens of thousands, and forced over 200,000 Chileans into exile. He burned the books of the people he killed. He wrote books himself while doing it. The books in the bonfires were not burned because Pinochet didn't read. They were burned because he read differently. He read strategy. He read geopolitics. He read economics. He had a framework, and within that framework, the books in the streets of Santiago were not culture. They were threat. The bonfires were not the act of ignorance. They were the act of a different literacy, one that had decided what knowledge was permissible and what knowledge had to go. Muammar Gaddafi published The Green Book in 3 parts between 1975 and 1979. He intended it as a replacement for both capitalism and Marxism, a third way that he called the Third Universal Theory. He considered it one of the most important political texts of the 20th century. He distributed it globally, had it translated into dozens of languages, required it to be studied in Libyan schools. He held seminars in which he discussed it at length in the manner of a philosopher presenting his system to students. The Green Book is not a serious work of political philosophy. It is the reading of a man who had absorbed enough Marxist theory and enough anti-colonial literature and enough Islamic political thought to produce something that resembles argument at a distance, the way a forgery resembles a painting at a distance, but does not hold up to examination. It contains genuine ideas. Some of its anti-parliamentary arguments have real precedence in serious political theory, surrounded by assertions, contradictions, and the kind of sweeping claims that only work if no one is allowed to disagree with you. Gaddafi had read Nasser, the Egyptian nationalist, and modelled himself initially on the pan-Arab socialist tradition. He had read Fanon, like Pol Pot, and taken from him the idea of revolutionary violence as liberation. He had read Islamic jurisprudence and selectively deployed it. He had not read widely enough or honestly enough for any of this reading to produce something other than a more elaborate version of his pre-existing convictions. The detail that illuminates everything. Gaddafi reportedly gave the Green Book as a gift to foreign heads of state and expected them to read it. He expected Thatcher to read it. He expected Reagan to read it. He expected the Secretary General of the United Nations to read it and be changed by it. This is the psychology of the man who has decided his reading has given him the answer, an answer not a contribution to an ongoing question, but the answer, and who cannot understand why other people, having been given access to it, would not immediately recognize this. He ran Libya for 42 years. He spent those 42 years in genuine belief that he had read his way to the truth. The thousands of Libyans who disappeared into his prisons, the dissidents murdered abroad, the civilians killed in the final uprising that ended his rule, none of this appears in the Green Book as a problem the theory needs to address. Idi Amin did not read widely. He was largely self-educated in the formal sense, having left school early, and the books he cited were often books he had been told about rather than books he had read himself. He read military manuals with genuine attention. He rose through the King's African Rifles under British colonial command. And he understood tactics. He read the Quran seriously, and his reading of it shifted dramatically toward its martial texts when he needed religious justification for what he was doing. He read, according to people who knew him, a great deal about Adolf Hitler. He expressed admiration. He sent a telegram to Israel in 1972 congratulating Germany for what Hitler had done. He awarded himself a medal he called the CBE, Conqueror of the British Empire, and declared himself the last King of Scotland. He was not doing this from any intellectual position. He was doing it because the idea of a strong man who remade an entire country according to his will was, to him, admirable on its face. Amin's case is instructive precisely because it shows what this argument is not saying. The suggestion that voracious reading is correlated with atrocity is not an argument that ignorance is safer. Amin killed somewhere between 100,000 and 500,000 Ugandans during his 8 years in power. He expelled the entire Asian community from Uganda. He had political opponents fed to crocodiles. He did not need Nietzsche. He did not need Rousseau. He needed the capacity to order deaths and a system that would carry out those orders and the psychological structure that made those deaths feel acceptable. He and Hitler were running the same psychological operation from opposite ends of the reading spectrum. Hitler used books to build the intellectual architecture of what he was going to do anyway. Amin simply did it without the architecture. The outcome was the same. The reading level was almost irrelevant. This is the most disturbing finding of this entire survey. Reading does not cause atrocity. Not reading does not prevent it. The variable that matters, the thing that determines whether a person in power will use that power to destroy, is not their relationship to books. It is something prior to books, something the books, whether present or absent, amplify rather than correct. Here is what the cognitive science shows, and it is considerably more complicated than the story we were told. Research into what is called narrative transportation, the psychological process of being absorbed into a story, does find evidence that fiction can increase certain forms of empathy, specifically the ability to model other people's mental states. People who read fiction extensively tend to be better at tasks that require imagining what someone else is thinking or feeling. This is a real effect. It has been replicated. But the research also shows that this effect is highly conditional. It depends on whether the reader identifies with characters unlike themselves. A reader who does so builds perspective. A reader who identifies only with characters like themselves, or who reads characters unlike themselves as foils or threats, is not building empathy. They are building a more sophisticated model of the other as enemy. And the research shows something else that almost never appears in the optimistic version of this story, that high intellectual engagement with difficult ideas does not necessarily produce moral development. Intelligence and moral reasoning are not the same capacity. Some of the most morally catastrophic human beings in history were operating at very high levels of abstract reasoning. They could hold complex ideas, trace logical implications, argue from principles. What they could not do or would not do was allow the reasoning to reach conclusions that threatened their core commitments. The philosopher Susan Wolfe has written about what she calls the moral luck of character, as the idea that the qualities that make someone a good person are not primarily the product of reasoning, but of something prior to reasoning. The person who treats others with dignity does not generally arrive at this through a philosophical argument. They arrive at it through something earlier, something about how they encounter other people before any argument begins. And the person who does not have this is not going to acquire it through reading, because reading is processed through the prior thing. Theodor Adorno, writing in the immediate aftermath of the Holocaust because he needed to understand how it had happened, studied what he called the authoritarian personality. What he found was not that authoritarian followers were unusually ignorant or uneducated. Some were, many were not. What they shared was a specific psychological structure, a high need for certainty, a strong tendency to identify with authority and to project threat onto outgroups, and a capacity to hold abstract values, order, purity, the nation, the tradition, that exempted them from the moral claims of specific other people. Books, for a person with this structure, are not a challenge to it. Books are ammunition for it. The reading confirms. The reading provides academic language for what the psychology already demands. Hitler's Schopenhauer, Stalin's Marx, Pol Pot's Rousseau, Hussein's Saladin, Pinochet's Géopolitique, Gaddafi's Fanon. Different books, same function, raw material for a structure that was already there. What reading can do, and what it reliably does, is give you more material to work with, more frameworks, more vocabulary, more historical precedent, more philosophical justification, more examples of people who did the thing you are inclined to do and called it something respectable. For the person whose priors are generous, the reading adds depth to the generosity. For the person whose priors are otherwise, the reading adds sophistication to the otherwise. Does this mean books do nothing? That the humanizing power of literature is a story we tell ourselves? No. But it means the mechanism is different from what we want it to be. The books that demonstrably change people are almost never the ones we think they should be. They are the books that find the person at the right moment when the prior self is fractured or uncertain, when the defenses are down, when something that was settled has become unsettled. The books that change people come in through the cracks. Frederick Douglass taught himself to read and then read the Columbian Orator, a book of political speeches, including arguments against slavery. He described this reading as the first thing that gave him language for his own situation. But Douglass was already desperate, already looking for the crack, already in a position where his prior self, and the self constructed by slavery, was under enormous internal pressure. The book did not change him, his situation changed him, and the book gave the changed self somewhere to go. Nelson Mandela read widely in prison on Robben Island. He read Tolstoy, he read African history, he read the ANC's foundational documents until he had them memorized. By his own account, the reading that affected him most was reading about other liberation movements, because it told him that the situation he was in was not unique, not permanent, not insuperable. The reading gave him a map, but he already knew he needed a map. Viktor Frankl, imprisoned in Auschwitz, had already written a draft of his core ideas before the war. When the manuscript was destroyed in the camp, he reconstructed it on scraps of paper. The experience of the camp then confirmed and deepened what he had already thought. The reading and writing and thinking were not separate from the experience. They were the means by which the experience became bearable and eventually transmissible to others. What these cases share is not the specific books. They share a reader who is genuinely open to being changed, who has something at stake, who is not reading to confirm, but reading because the confirmation they had before has failed them, or been destroyed, or revealed itself as inadequate. The books came in through the crack that reality had opened. This is rare. It was apparently absent in every man on this list, despite their extensive libraries. Hitler's reading has a quality of accumulation without revision. His annotations become more certain over time, not less. Stalin's curiosity was always curved around the fixed point of his own authority. Pol Pot left Paris more certain than he arrived. Hussein became more convinced of his own literary genius with each novel. Pinochet's reading of geopolitics never produced a single doubt about what geopolitics required him to do. The question for the reader who is not a dictator, for you specifically, is which kind of reading you are doing. Whether the books you have read have actually changed you, revised something, forced you to rebuild a conclusion you had arrived at before you opened them, or whether they have primarily confirmed, added vocabulary to what was already there, made you more sophisticated about the positions you already held. There is nothing wrong with reading for pleasure or for confirmation. There is something wrong with mistaking that reading for intellectual growth, and there is something very wrong with believing that because you read, you are safe from the mechanisms that reading exploits in the worst people. Hitler's books are in a library in Munich. Scholars can apply to see them. The annotations are in pencil, in his cramped Austrian hand. In the margins of a book about Frederick the Great, he wrote, "A great man can never be diminished by his enemies, only by himself." He underlined it. He agreed with it while running a war that would kill 70 million people and end with him in a bunker putting a bullet in his head. Saddam Hussein finished his fourth novel while American soldiers were searching for him in the rubble of a country he had run for 24 years. Pol Pot died peacefully in 1998, in his sleep, in a jungle camp on the Thai-Cambodian border, having never faced trial. Pinochet died under house arrest in 2006, having spent years evading prosecution. Stalin died in his bed. The books did not save their victims, the books did not save their readers, they did not redeem, did not correct, did not reach past the prior self to the thing that might have been capable of change. Reading is not transformation, reading is encounter. What you do with the encounter depends on something that was there before the book opened, and will be there after it closes. The people who read their way into something better did so because they were already trying to get somewhere. The people on this list read their way into something far worse because they were looking in every page for permission. The question every reader eventually faces, the one that the dictators' libraries force into the open, is not how much you have read. It is what you have allowed it to do to you, and whether, when you close the book, you are a different person from the one who opened it, or just a more articulate version of the same one.